Hello and welcome to Need to Know British Cultural Studies. Today we're going to talk about Orientalism and nationalism. I want to begin by defining what the Orient is. And I think what is important here is it is very closely related to colonialism. So when people from the so-called Western Hemisphere started colonializing other parts of the world, it was mainly Asia, mainly the Eastern Hemisphere, mainly what we call the Orient today. And so we can say it's a historical category for describing some parts of the world which are not the West, not the Occident, not the part of the world where the colonizers came from. Now, I think it's important to look at where is the Orient. And if we have different maps, as on that slide here, we can say it's actually not so easy to pinpoint where it is. Some of those maps describe the Orient as Asia, only parts of Asia or the whole of Asia. Some say, okay, some parts of Africa are not actually the Orient, but are influenced by it. And there's some other islands below Asia, which are also some part or somehow influenced, but Australia and the rest of Africa are not. There's also a map, and this is the one you can't see completely, where it says that, well, Russia is not the Orient, but all the rest of Asia and all of Africa and also Australia and everything that's surrounding it. So we do have different territorial description of where is it. And now I think it's also very important to think about, okay, who defines the Orient? And this is definitely not the Orient themselves, especially historically. So who defines the Orient is usually answered with the West. Those who go there and colonize those countries, those who want to have knowledge about it to dominate it. So it's not a definition by themselves, but rather by other people. And so we can say that it's not a territorial definition, or at least not only, but rather a discursive set of cultural ascriptions. So a set of knowledge, attitudes, and also power relations that discursively shapes a social reality, an idea of where is the Orient, what is the Orient, and how is it different from those people who are describing the Orient in their terms. Now, based on the idea of the Orient as the other, as the Eastern countries, no matter where they are, but as this set of ascriptions and cultural idea, we do have Orientalism. And Edward Said famously described Orientalism in three different ways. First, as an academic discipline related to knowledge. So he said that Oriental studies basically do Orientalism. So everyone who produces knowledge about the Orient by studying it, teaching it, writing about it, so on an educational level, of course, is engaging in Orientalism as an academic discipline. This is the first definition. The second is Orientalism as a style of thought related to representation. This is now not so much related to educational purposes, but rather to literature, art, or the media image of the Orient, so to say. And it's also very much related to this distinction between the Orient and the Occident. So we and the other, this exotic part of the world that's different from Europe, that's mainly also different from America, so different from the West. And it's an ontological and epistemological description. Ontological means that it's about where does the world come from. So the East or Orient has a different origin than the Occident is a main thought here. And also epistemological. So which knowledge is created? What is the worldview of the people? How do those people think about the world, and how is that different? So we have this really broad distinction that is represented in literature, art, and everything that we can count as media image of this, Orient in this case. So this is called Orientalism. And then, and that's the important perspective for us, or the most important, we do have Orientalism as a colonial discourse related to power. And Said writes about it, quote, a Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, unquote. And so what we can find here is that actually also those other perspectives, other definitions, so academic discipline and style of thought, are subsumed in that discourse. They are some forms of knowledge, they engage in producing knowledge about the Orient, so they are also influenced by this colonial discourse. And as you might remember, this is of course a Foucauldian perspective. So Foucault's idea of the discourse as organized and organizing bodies of knowledge that at one hand have this idea of, okay, what is right and what is wrong about a certain topic, in this case the Orient, and also how does this constitute a social reality for those people who engage in producing this knowledge and also who know it in their terms. And yes, as I just said, it has influence on the other definitions, because if you produce knowledge about the Orient, then of course this is influenced by what is known already and what is seen as truth, and so this discourse. And also if you are trying to represent something, you follow a certain discourse. You follow a certain formation of what is already known, what can you say, what can't you say, and what is the perspective of the social reality that is associated with, in this case, the Orient. Now, here's an example of how the West imagines the East. In this case, it's the Southeast and some islands, which is not the center of the Orient, but also has the same structures of thinking, the same structures of discursively shaping a reality. So the question for you would be, take some time and link this picture to Said's definitions of Orientalism. And you can think about knowledge. How does this picture create knowledge about certain people? So, I mean, if we look at it, we have people who have a different skin color, so also racialized ideas come into play, and who are not wearing clothes, who are in some cases carrying clothed and white-skinned people. So they are seen as inferior. They are seen as also wild and primitive because they don't wear clothes. They are presented in an environment that is nature, that is not cities, that is not urbanized, and in an environment that can also be seen as underdeveloped. So it creates a certain image and circulates knowledge, especially if you think about the fact that people who see that picture have never seen those islands, they have never seen those people. This is something new to them, and this is how they see it, because this is how it's represented to them. And it's also related to power. So if you represent the other as the inferior category, if you say, okay, those people are inferior to us and we can use them to our disposal because we are the superior, then it legitimizes colonialism, it legitimizes injustice. And now the next question would be, okay, how does Orientalism work? We have touched upon that in the previous slide, but of course we can go more deeply into it and find theoretical terms that also help us apply this to further pictures and other contexts. And so the first and one of the most important concepts here is othering. You may have heard about that in previous videos or tutorials, but othering describes that we have an us-them distinction. So people are thinking about their own perspectives by saying, okay, we are what the other is. We are not what the other is. We are different than the other, and the other is, in this case, usually inferior. The other is wild and primitive, and we are civilized, for example. This would be othering. So using a different category, in this case person category, to describe what one's own identity is. And the Orient here is positioned as the cultural opposition to the Occident. So basically the reason why the Occident can say, we are not like them, we are civilized. We are not like them, we are modern, we have cities, they don't, so we are better than them. So this idea of we can position ourselves in a better light because we have something we can contrast ourselves against. And this also links neatly to binary oppositions or binary opposites, so that we do not have a differentiated, complex, or diverse picture that acknowledges, okay, there are similarities and differences, and the differences are maybe also depending on the really country you go into, but rather this idea of we do have a homogenized Orient that is contrasting our Occident. So a whole homogenized idea of, okay, this is Oriental, this is different from us, and we also are homogenized as the Occident. This us-we distinction, of course, coming from othering, and not because I think it myself, but rather because this is how Orientalism and Orientalist thoughts shape those binary oppositions. And it also has something to do with hegemony, so that the Orient is dominated by the East or Occident by consent. Of course, this does not mean that the people who are seen as Oriental just consented to them being dominated when they first saw the Europeans, but there is much more at work there. I think we can describe it as that knowledge about the Orient is created from a Western perspective. So we have this colonial discourse, people positioning themselves as higher than the people they colonialize and thus legitimizing colonialism. And this creates a social reality of the Orient in Western thought. First, in Western thought. So people who are living in, for example, the UK at that time, rather England and Scotland and Wales, it wasn't the UK yet. People living there being educated through pictures as the one we just saw, through certain ideas of knowledge into the direction of, okay, this is what the Orient is like, and then also being indoctrinated to believe that those people are inferior and the British people are better and thus are fully allowed to colonialize or colonize whatever they want. And this framework is, of course, also applied to the Oriental context then. So we do have this cultural imperialism, taking one cultural framework, in this case the British, and applying it to a different context. For example, India, which is, of course, part of the Orient then. And this creates a social hierarchy also in the Oriental context and basically forces the people to believe they are inferior. And then we have this hegemony of people who are also in that Oriental context consent to them being dominated because they're forced to believe so. Now, here you find several so-called Orientalist buzzwords, which are used in the colonialist discourse about the Orient, but also in some academic, especially older academic works. So when people with a certain framework of what is the Orient in mind try to describe it in academic terms, then of course you have this idea of, okay, the Occident, the West is modern and the Orient is different, and you have those binary distinctions here. And of course, also in representations, as the picture we just saw, but also literature about the Orient uses those distinctions. And what you can gather from those buzzwords, you can read them yourselves, I don't want to read them out, is that the Occident is seen as superior and also the Orient then as inferior. So you have this hierarchy. And one thing I want you to think about is, how does this link to colonialism? Think about superiority. Okay, if some nations can position themselves as superior, then of course they legitimize colonizing other nations, or not nations, but rather countries, parts of the world. An objectification as well, because we do have, if you look at the buzzwords, feminine and the body in the Oriental sphere. So women were at that time, at older times, seen as, well, mostly property of men, not as individuals in their own right. So we do have this objectification through gendered perspectives, and also this idea of, okay, if the woman in those times, like for example the 17th or 18th century, when those Orientalist discourses began, if the woman is seen as, well, an object and a person you can just use to your disposal if you are a man, then of course the Orient here is seen as exactly the same as a, well, not a woman, but rather a part of the world that can be used to your disposal, that can be colonized, whose resources can be exploited by the more masculine and superior Occident. So we do also have patriarchal norms at work here, of course. And we have a racialized perspective. This might not feature here so much because we don't have racialized terminology here, but if you think about it, the Occident is, of course, the part of the world where the people are white, and people from the Orient are mostly distinguished from the people from the Occident by they look different. They do not only behave different, but they mostly look different. And so we also have those racialized categories here. And if we take all this into consideration, those Orientalist buzzwords represent an ideology and also a mental framework that allows to dominate and use the Orient if you are part of the Occident, of course. And here I have a second application example, which is John Webber's portrait of Princess Padua, which dates back to approximately the 1770s. And yeah, the question would be, analyze the portrait under the perspective of Orientalism as a colonial discourse. Of course, I don't want to let you go into that without any context, so here's some context information. It was painted when Padua was a captive on James Cook's ship on an expedition to the Polynesian islands, where Padua was princess. She is, funny enough, not portrayed as a captive, but rather as though they just stumbled upon her somewhere in the wilderness. Um, it is one of the first images of a Polynesian woman, so you can say that this is definitely with an educational purpose. And if people see this as this is a Polynesian woman, we of course come across the burden of representation here, so that Padua doesn't stand as an individual, but rather for every woman of her race. And of course, this creates a certain image in the people of in the mind of the British. And what is also, I think, important is that her posture resembles the traditional portrayals of Venus, so the goddess of fertility and love and beauty. And so we do have a certain idea of what are the people on the Polynesian islands like, what are they portrayed as, and what knowledge do we create by painting them as such. You can think about the picture yourself. If you want more information, then you can go onto that website I indicated below. It's basically the website of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where you could actually see that picture, and yeah, where it's described in full detail. And you can also use this in order to analyze and think about, okay, what can you gather from that picture? Now let's delve into the second topic of today's video, which is nationalism. Behind me you can read the definition by the Oxford English Dictionary, and you can definitely take some time to read through all of that. But we can also just summarize it and say nationalism is an ideology associated with the nation, actually not the nation as an universalized and all-encompassing concept, but rather with a certain nation that is placed at the center of political and social life, and thus also used to create the basis for national identity, so the identity of people within this nation. In cultural studies, we use Anderson's concept of the nation to analyze nationalist practices and the nation as a concept. He defines the nation as, quote, an imagined political community and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign, unquote. All right, what does this mean? It's an imagined community. Imagined so nobody ever knows all the members of their respective nation, but still there is this imagination that all these members share certain characteristics and you have some values or perspectives in common with those people, that you share a culture, and this creates the basis for the nation as a concept. So it's imagined, and still this imagination holds everything together. It's limited because you always have borders that define where one nation ends and the other nation begins. And you always have an other that defines a certain nation. So for example, in order to define where England is, you have to say, okay, England is basically bordering Wales and Scotland. And you have to have these borders and distinctions to define one nation. It's also a sovereign concept, and this may sound old-fashioned. Well, it is old-fashioned because the nation is basically an Enlightenment concept, and so the nation as an overarching unifying force replaced the king and was seen as how can the people, as the nation, be the ones standing before God? Why don't they need a king? Because the people as nation can stand before God and be themselves the sovereign unifying force on top of society. They basically rule in freedom of a king. So you can take the French Revolution as an example to think about, okay, why does the nation have to be a sovereign concept? And last but not least, the nation is a concept of a community. So not of one person or two, but of a community of people that experience a comradeship, a togetherness of all the people in one nation. And one prominent example is, for example, football championships, where people describe that we won or we were beaten and really define themselves as part of this national community, even though this is an imagined community. Now, to end this video, I have two application tasks. The first would be Britain and nationalism, the second then the BBC proms and the last night of the proms as an example of a probably nationalist and definitely patriotic practice in the British context. But let's first look at the Britain or the British Isles and nations and nationalism in that context. You can see the map there, and based on that map, think about which nation or nations belong to this British context. How is national belonging represented? Not only in this map, but you can take this map as a starting point. And also, do you know about national myths, so cultural texts that define shared origins, developments, or characteristics of a nation. So which ones of them can you find for those different nations, or the one nation maybe, in the British context? And also, how does this situation of the British Isles really complicate national identity? For example, if you take the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland as an example. And now, for the second example, you need to know what the BBC proms are. And of course, it's not expected that you know it from before. So here's a short explanation of the BBC proms and also where that comes from. So I think what's most important here, the BBC proms as an informal series of classical concerts with the aim of getting more people, especially from the lower social classes, into the music halls to really share this classical music over a wider population. And now this proms as a series of concerts lasts for 8 weeks, and then it ends. And it ends with the so-called last night of the proms, which is the most famous of all the concerts and has, well, some rituals. And one of the rituals is that many people come and many people have their flags with them. And you can see some flags which are not British here, but mostly it's Union Jacks and also other flags associated with Britain and also England, Scotland, Wales, of course. And you do have certain rituals in the program. And so this photograph is from the 2024 Last Night of the Proms, and the program is from the same concert. And I think the first parts are like, yes, classic music, also from international composers. The second part is also more or less international, but you also have the Fantasia and British Sea songs, which is also very much something that they usually play. And the last set is really what they usually do. These are nationalist songs and pieces which are played every year and which are usually also sung together. So you do have Rule Britannia, you have Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance. If you don't know the pieces, maybe look at them or maybe look at the song texts. Rule Britannia is basically about Britannia being the ruler of the waves and basically colonizing all parts of the world, really nationalism and an imperial song in a way. Pomp and Circumstance is a longer series of music pieces, and it contains, for example, Land of Hope and Glory as a song, which is also super nationalist. Jerusalem has one line in it which titles, or basically goes that the British want to build an own Jerusalem on the British Isles. So basically also, we are British, we are the best, we want to build our own Jerusalem here. The national anthem, of course, in Auld Lang Syne is also super traditional. So you do have quite some songs associated with Britishness and national pride. And this Last Night of the Proms really has an attitude for expressing national pride, also in an ecstatic fashion that is definitely not seen on the streets. I also found 2 articles which you could read when you want to, which are about nationalism and the Last Night of the Proms. And I think this is a very good example of how is nationalism and how is the nation as a concept represented in culture, especially in British culture. And now the same procedure as always. Here are my sources, and I hope that you liked the video and that you could take something for yourselves with you from the video, and thank you for listening.